Hello, welcome to Revive and Rise. I'm your host, Melody Parrish, and I want to thank you so much for joining us today. We have a very special guest, Derric Gilliard. He is a very accomplished author of many books. He worked in the White House in the HHS with 5 different president administrations, and he also worked in Dr. King's organization as the communications specialist. So we are so glad that you're with us and so excited to hear everything you have to say. Thank you so much, Derric.
Well, thank you, Melody. It's good to be part of your show, your podcast, and I'm glad to be here today. As always, thankful for each and every day. Right?
Yes. So can you share with us like maybe a story or a little background about you?
Sure, sure. And let me, but just before I do that, I want to correct one thing. So I did work for 5 administrations. No, I did not work in the White House, though. I worked in one of the 10 regional offices that the federal government structure has. So I worked out of the Atlanta office, and in that role, we were responsible in U.S. Department of Health and Human Services for the states of Alabama, Florida, Georgia, Mississippi, Kentucky, Tennessee, North Carolina, and South Carolina. Now, I did go to Washington several times a year and did get to go to the White House a few times. But yeah, so I'd actually worked for and one of the things I think that makes my story more interesting is many of the people, in my opinion, inside the DC Beltway really aren't in touch with the real people out in the Mississippi Delta or the P. Diddy, South Carolina, or in the Kentucky coal miners. All of those are some of the areas that we in South Florida where, you there's all these different languages, the Haitians, the Cubans, the black people, the white people. So I get a real taste in all the rural states that we have, the farmers. So it's very different than working inside the Beltway. But I think they're both important. But those people are there for 4 years or they're there for 8 years at most. And our role as a career federal person, we tend to be the continuity because when they come and go and their policies change back and forth depending on the party, and we tend to be the stability and I think a lot of the intellectual properties for the organization. But yes, I would say born in 1954, and my parents were both military people. Mother from near Atlanta, a place called Stockbridge, which actually is a hometown of Dr. King's father. They called him Daddy King, who was a prominent minister in Atlanta later and uh, was the pastor of Ebenezer Baptist Church, which is really made famous because of Dr. King's connection there on historic Auburn Avenue. And at that time, Stockbridge was a real agrarian, deeply segregated community. And now it's kind of a bustling little suburb of Atlanta doing good things, has money, et cetera, et cetera. My father is from a little town outside of Shreveport, Louisiana, called Benton, Louisiana. And so both of them had, I think my mother, there may have been 10 kids. My father, there were 12. And in their day, uh, Black people probably had two chances to kind of leave or escape or move beyond that agrarian society, whether you're raising, crops and picking in the fields all day. That's why you needed big families to manage all those acres whatever acres you were responsible for, whether you owned them or served as sharecroppers. And one of the ways that people did, they either moved north and tried to go into the factories, like in Detroit, the automobile factory or one of those others, or they joined the military. So both my parents, they met in the military. My father and his five brothers all served in the military. Now, he's the only one that made it a career. And
Mhm.
so, because of that, I had the opportunity to move around a lot, and I think it helped my worldview. I think that's an important part of the person that I am, I think today, because I had the opportunity, unlike some people I know, to live and get to know and be friends and be in regular contact with all kinds of people, black people, white people, Asian people, Latino, because, and so, and even people in other countries. I think I was 3.5 years old to 4 on the boat to Germany.
Mhm.
So, but uh, at the time I was born, uh, it's just this basically right when Emmett Till was murdered, and because he allegedly whistled at a white woman in Money, Mississippi, and two grown men came to the house he was down visiting from Chicago, and you know the story. And they pulled him out in the middle of the night and took him and beat him and threw him into the river with a cotton gin tied around his neck. And then, of course, his mom came down. She'd sent him down to stay with her uncle for a few days, just to get him out of Chicago, see some other parts of the world, and she came down. Of course, the death was so horrific that she insisted on an open casket funeral, and so people could see the horror of man's, as Dr. King called it, man's inhumanity to man, that you would do that to a 14-year-old child, and who you clearly did not see as human. And so those were the kind of things that, and I wasn't cognizant of that until a few years ago, because that was right at the time I was born. And the next year, of course, Dr. King and Rosa Parks on December 1st, 1955, launched the Montgomery bus boycott, the 381-day Montgomery bus boycott. So these were some of the really seminal things going on right then. So our society was deeply segregated, and I had this illusion and this misillusion, even though most of these things really, the most well known, happened in the Deep South. I thought it was a Southern phenomena. Now,
Mhm.
it was more than a Southern phenomenon. We can see that even today. But that was what my young juvenile mind thought. So I was excited about leaving the South and went to Germany and spent about 3 years there. Learned some German, wore my Lederhosen as a, on my little bicycle, and went to school with a bunch of other military kids and on a base. But we lived in German society, and so made different friends, but it was a different exposure because, for example, I know kids at our inner city church here in Atlanta who have never left Fulton County, which is, the major metropolitan county in Atlanta, which blows my mind because that's the totality of their worldview. And so I've been blessed and been able to, when we were there in Germany those few years, I mean, we visited Austria, we did visit in England, we got on the, I can't remember the name of the freeway, but it takes you all over Europe. So we traveled, and I mean, he was just an enlisted man, didn't make much money, but that was a real gift that he gave me. And so when we came back, but this was, oh, I did need to mention this. When my mother was trying to get her college degree, even while my father was off serving, and I had lived in a small house, and at that point in time, we didn't have indoor plumbing. I mean, you had running water in the faucet, but we had an outhouse, a two-seater outhouse, and it was me, my younger sister, who had just been born because my mother was living in Atlanta going to school, my aunt who had a daughter, And then she had an older sister who had died and left three young boys, and they were like 10, 7, and 5. So all of us were in this little two-bedroom house, and we used to take a bath in the big iron kettle, like pot. I don't know what you could cast iron pot, and and so if you were the youngest, you took the water, you took the bath in the dirtiest water, and so but all that was cool because we were close. But this is the part that I wanted to share here. So in that day, unlike today you have dark skin like me, African Americans who prominent and positive figures that are seen as handsome and dashing. But this was the era where um, there were no positive images, almost no positive images of all of Black people. And there was this tendency to, even the little girls, they liked the light skinned guys and they liked people with the straight hair because, yeah, probably are familiar with the Kenneth Clark doll test in the early 50s, and where you even in front of Black kids, you put a white doll, a black doll, and a brown doll, and they always thought that the white doll was pretty, was good, was uh, all these things. So my all of my older cousins that I ran around trying to keep up with when I was 2.5, 3, they gave me the nickname Skillet. Now, as you know, Skillet is black. There's no reflection in the skillet. And I don't, it wasn't to be, I mean, I guess they called me that affectionately, but I was the blackest and the smallest. And so I kind of grew up with that kind of self-image. And I don't think I realized until much, much later that that was traumatic. That was trauma on me. I knew I wanted to escape the the environment because of what I saw, and I saw the Jim Crow society that I could not. My parents could not go in and sit down at most restaurants and order a meal. They had to go to the pickup window and get it. They couldn't. My mother couldn't go in and try on a blouse or skirt or a pair of shoes because if her black body touched it, it was considered, you know. Now they wanted your money, but they didn't want you to see you as full citizen. So I left that because again, this was 10 years before the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 64. And so my parents, when I was born, could not vote. They did not have the right to vote. So that was a trauma in a sense. I'll tell you another instance is that when we came back from Germany, and my younger sister, she's like 3.5 years younger, she remembers a lot more than I do, all the dates and all the specific instances. But I do remember we were in the car with my dad, and he got stopped by some cops, and we were in the back seat, peering out of the back seat window. And again, he's a military man, and I'll tell you that he fought 2 tours in Vietnam and one in Korea. The military was great for him because he again came from a society where he got up early in the morning, worked hard all day. They all did that, and so the military, he is good at following orders, and he could do all that. He was very efficient. He was respectful, and that's something that's I think served me very well in my career. But yeah, and then he finally retired after being shot down out of a helicopter in Vietnam. So he's a very esteemed. He rose to the highest rank an enlisted person could get in the army. He was a command sergeant major, and so to see them pull him out and rough him up, and I'm sure he was being very compliant. That was one of the traumatic things, in my life and for me and my younger sister. And the thing about it is, and I came to understand a lot later on, my younger sister, who far more, I will tell you, I would say brilliant than me, had a lot more genius and maybe capability to be a world changer, but I at least had a great role model in my father, and that was very helpful for me. And he actually did not have the same in my mother, and so I have to always remember that that plays a big part in who you become. But so I remember that as a traumatic instance. I remember another one. We were we had lived in Atlanta at the time, and I was still again under 10. And I think we were headed back to Louisiana to my father's. And we were either going for a family reunion because they had family reunions every other year. And that was a real good thing for me because because as a military kid moving around all the time, you don't have the kind of roots that people have who start kindergarten with somebody and the same people you graduate with 12 years later. And, you go back and Johnny is still on the block. And, so I didn't have that. And so the few long-term friends I have are that much more special to me. So we were traveling. And in those days, my parents, there's something called the Green Book, and I don't know if you're familiar with the Green Book, but it's
Mhm.
something African American families used in the 50s and the 60s and before, so that as you traveled, if you could look for a safe place to stay if you were going to be on a very long trip, because you couldn't stay in the hotels because they didn't accept black people. And again, you couldn't stop in most restaurants, and you were leery at stopping in gas stations. And so you tried not to have to stop at night. So from Atlanta to Shreveport, it's roughly like about a 12-hour trip. And for some reason or another, we did stop. I don't remember if we stopped for gas or we stopped to use the restroom. But so my mother took me into the restroom, and well, my dad was getting gas, I'm sure, somewhere Alabama or Mississippi. And I remember uh, when we used the restroom that said colored, because
Mhm.
you had, you know, men, women, and you had colored. And the colored restroom was filthy. It was unkempt. It was all those things that you would expect for somebody who saw you as a second class citizen or no better than a cow or a sheep in their pasture. And so, just like at home, however, when I finished doing my business, washed my hands, flipped the light off, and turned the water off. So I walk out, and my mother grabs my hand. She turns the water back on. She flips the light back on, and she's really angry at me. And I had no idea why. I didn't understand. And it wasn't until I was an adult and started thinking about it again, I realized that the only way she could strike back at this unjust system that dehumanized her and her children were to waste the resources. And so that was it, you know what I'm saying? Because what else could she do? Because if you said something back, you retorted, you challenged them, you know, you get shot down. That happened all the time. People were found in the river like Emmett Till. I mean, people uh, were just assaulted for just trying to vote and trying to teach people how to read. So those were very real instances. I remember another time that when I was I think when we got back from Germany, and we lived in Fort Riley, Kansas, and I remember I was in school, and I do remember, in fact, the day we were in school and Kennedy was assassinated, and I remember going home, and my parents, they were very quiet and they were somber and they were watching on the news because it was late in the afternoon when it happened. And they told us at school, and I remember how they reacted. And I don't think Kennedy was not necessarily this great shining arbiter of freedom and justice, but I think that things happened, good things happened under his administration. I think he was, and of course, had he not been assassinated, other good things would have happened. But so that was a kind of a trauma that was on the whole country, but it was even more so, I think, in the Black community. But I
Mhm.
had this teacher named Mr. Facklum later in the fifth grade, and he was somebody, the first white person that I remember to this day that I remember his name, that he kind of befriended me, took me under his arm. And this was in a school, again, it was on a military base. So there were all kind of kids, white kids, black kids, Latino kids, Asian kids. But that I had personally can remember a white, an adult who took a personal interest in me and kind of served as a sort of a mentor and a guide for me. So that was a positive thing I wanted to share. I did not forget that act of kindness. And I'll tell you this, and I'll continue on that kindness trip if I can. We um, my parents, my father in particular, always was inviting strangers in to stay with us. And I remember one time when it was not a good thing because these were some strangers on the run. But basically, it was the act of kindness that I saw. And again, I mentioned earlier my aunt who was, I think, two removed from my mother, older aunt. My mother was the youngest, and her younger sister had, died because Black people didn't have access to health care in many instances because you had white hospitals and Black hospitals. So there was nothing, that many of them died of very treatable illnesses. And she was in her late 20s when she died. And so when my aunt took her three children her three young boys in to her small house, so that was something that was kind of sewn into me as that was the way I should be that kind of person. I should have that kind of attitude because my wife, who is a pastor, she says this all the time, and I believe it. And she says, we're blessed to be a blessing. All of us have what we have. And a lot of times, I mean, hopefully we worked hard for it. We were honest in getting it, but it's to be shared in some way or another. And and hopefully this makes some sense. And so the fact honesty is even as when we got married, and lots of people who either were on hard times or in transition stayed with us for various periods of time.
Mhm.
Uh, my mother-in-law was very much like that, and she lived in Chicago on the south side of Chicago. And there's this young lady who was abused by her stepfather, and and at some point, she kind of took her in. And then when the young lady went to college in the Deep South in Holly Springs, Mississippi, after on her summers, she would come to live with us, care for our two small children. And then when she graduated, she came and lived with us for a year. And so those kind of things. And then my daughter, who actually wasn't even born at the time, but she saw it later on. And then when my wife had homeschooled her. All of our three of our two boys were only homeschooled briefly, and one just because just needed to be put in check. But he was doing great in school. The other one wasn't not so well. But my daughter was homeschooled through the 10th grade. And then in the 11th grade, she convinced her mom, says, Mom, I'm going to need to be able to get into society and know how more things work. And so she begged her and begged her. So she went to, while her older brothers had went to a more prestigious school that was a little more in our community, she went to a school that was mostly kids that were from throughout the diaspora. Most of them were on lunch assistants, and they were from every country you could think of. And almost immediately, she brings this kid home who dad had got him out of foster care in Miami. His mom had put him in foster care as a early teenager. She felt like she couldn't handle him. Well, this kid was here. His dad had gotten him out, brought him here, and taught him the lawn care business and would take him all the way across metro Atlanta, leave him to do a job and tell him figure out how to get home. So this kid was sleeping in the park. And she comes and says, "Mom and Dad, there's this kid. He's met him in school. Can he live with us?" And so actually, it's interesting because I kind of was beyond most of the stuff with the hard-headed sons. All my kids were really good. I never had to get any of them out of jail. None of them were on drugs or anything. So we were very blessed. But still, we had gotten to, the boys were all through. This is my youngest. And so we brought this kind of chaos into our house, but we kind of felt like it was the right thing to do. I was able to get him on my health insurance with the government. And he always was very suspicious because he had been in like 8 or 10 foster care and nobody really was looking out for him. And so he graduated. We helped get him into college at Fisk, and now he's doing really, really well. And so we feel good about that. It was a heck of a lot of trauma in that period of time, lots of stuff going on, and we almost fought several times. The next year, she brings another one home. So what I'm saying is, though, um, and we don't aren't in touch with that one, but just the first one is a real success story. He shoots for the NFL. He's a really good uh, photographer and videography. He has his own company now. He shoots for the PGA. He does all this kind of work in Nashville. It's really cool. So every time I see him, I tell him how proud I am of him because from where he comes, and he doesn't even have any real relationship with his birth family now. And so, but again, people have been good to me and kind to me, and I've seen it. I think it always comes back to you.
Yeah.
So hopefully that's helpful for that. And I'll tell you, the first time I went, I was really kind of the first generation, the tail end of the first generation of African American who could kind of go to any school that they had the grades to get into. So this was kind of in the early stages of affirmative action. And whereas, for example, uh, the University of Georgia, University of Alabama, Vanderbilt, these schools in the Deep South, Black people couldn't go to them until, I'm going to say, the very early 60s. And so I went to school and I graduated high school in 1973. And I became clear that I wasn't going to be the pro baseball player that I'd hoped I was going to be, I also like to read and write, and I decided to become a journalist. And so I applied for the University of Kansas, which had a well-known print journalism school. And that was probably because that's the part of the country I was in at that particular time. I had gone to 4 different high schools in 3 different states.
Oh,
I think my ninth grade year was in Atlanta. Uh, my 10th grade year was in Texas, back in Atlanta for my 11th grade year, my 12th grade year in Kansas. So, the continuity just wasn't there. And so I didn't have counselors who knew me, knew my strength. And so when I went to University of Kansas, and then I think when I finally got where I was working on the school newspaper, and I remember writing my first article and turning it in to the editor. Of course, all the editors were white. There weren't very many. There were maybe 500 Black people in the university out of about 20,000. So he looks at my article that I was assigned to write about this scientist, this KU scientist who had invented something. And he asked me, "Who wrote this for you?" So it was beyond his belief or concept that this little Black kid who he knew nothing about could actually have the ability to produce this himself. So I'm sure that was some level of informed trauma. It just made me mad. No, I didn't react angrily, but I remembered, and it helped me understand that I was being prejudged in this society. I'd be in some of these big lecture classes, and there would be 300 people, and there would be 3 people who looked like me. So those were some of the things. And then when um, I was spent 10 years with USA Today, their first 10 years, but not as a full-time person, but I wrote this segment that they had in their newspaper across the USA. And I always wrote about what was something that was going on here in Georgia. And I wrote for Time magazine. When I first got out of college, I spent a year at the largest paper in Kansas, the Wichita Eagle Beacon. And in that era, in the 70s, lots of towns had a morning paper and an evening paper. And then they closed the evening paper down, and I lost my job. And I came back to Atlanta. But my life really changed in 1996. And I did several things. I worked at two historically black colleges and universities, Clark Atlanta University, which, by the way, W.E.B. Du Bois taught at many, many years before, and then at Fort Valley State College. And both times I was a public affairs, public information officer in the first one, and later a director of college and community relations. But then when I came back and started my own public relations firm, small firm, boutique startups and small businesses, churches, etc. But in 1994, I was looking for a job because it's always a hustle working for yourself, right? Do you pay the bills? Do you keep the lights on? All that. And I needed, I was looking for a little more stability and walked into the doors. Dr. King's organization. I've been in there before as a reporter covering press conferences because Dr. Joseph Lowery is a very prominent civil rights leader. Again, co-founded the organization in 1957 with Dr. King and a group of maybe over 60 other Southern ministers. And he hired me as his national communications director. And so at that point in time was the beginning of me understanding what my life's work was to be. And so everything, my two books that I've written, I write through the prism of race, faith, and justice. And everything I do is informed by those three things.
Wow.
And so we dealt with all kind of issues that I think were important. Like one of the things was certainly hate crimes. I don't know if you remember a guy named James Byrd, and I can't remember the city in Texas. He was grabbed by these three Klansmen, or three people. They may not have officially been Klansmen, but they had this affiliation, and they drug his body until he was decapitated, and all these kind of things. They're horrible things, but my boss would speak out against those all the time. We were very involved in things like the organization had something called Wings of Hope. And it was George Bush Sr.'s, one of his 1,000 points of light, and one of the community organizations that were doing really powerful things to impact their community. And it was something that it was an organization dealt with things like HIV AIDS, because that was something that most people in the Black community did not want to discuss back in the 70s and the 80s. And they were one of the, if not the first, one of the first civil rights organizations to really start talking about that as a considered consistent and important issue. We dealt with drugs in the drugs and drug reform in the African American, really dealing with crack, powdered cocaine. One of our issues also was addressing disparity in sentencing, because the powdered cocaine is a wealthy person's drug. We consider it a white person's drug, a privileged person's drug. Where crack cocaine and the sentence, why would the sentence be 4 and 5 times higher if you were busted with crack cocaine? And so those kind of things. So we dealt with things like educational tracking. So many Black kids, particularly in rural communities, uh, were Black and brown kids were automatically, it didn't matter how you may have tested, you were directed to the vocational areas. Like you were taught to be a brick mason, a mechanic, a plumber, a landscaper, and not saying anything bad about any of those areas, but I'm saying if you were more inclined to be a physician or a scientist or an architect, those opportunities were not presented to you, and you were educationally tracked based on things like that. Certainly, we were all on issues like voter education, voter registration, and things that are so germane today, like redistricting that is being attempted in Texas to, shut out people like Jasmine Crockett because, again, she's so outspoken and such a powerful influence and a thorn in the side of the MAGA community. So we dealt with that. In fact, and this is an interesting thing, we almost never saw a victory. Okay. And that's one of the things I tell young people today because the young people were excited about Kamala Harris and came to vote in droves and they believed that change was coming. And then we're disappointed because, she did not win. And so we campaigned for all these people and almost never did they win. But we understood we were playing the long game. And so the things that we were really, so we did fight and got Georgia another black congressional district. And that happened during my time at the SCLC. And the first congresswoman was Cynthia McKinney, and she's in a district I currently live in. And so that was a very major victory. And even I would say that in the 20, would that have been in the 2020 election, um, when the two senators from Georgia hadn't had a Democratic senator since in over 25 years. And then uh, Pastor Raphael Warnock and Senator John Ossoff, the youngest Jewish senator, and the first African American senator in the Deep South since Reconstruction, were both elected. And a lot of that goes all the way back to the work we did in the 90s and the work even before that. And so sometimes you may not see it. And that kind of leads me into my first book. So we kept running around the country and I kept meeting these people, Melody. They were 70, 80, 90 years old. And a lot of them had no health insurance, had no life insurance, no 401k, no pension. They had some Social Security. And a lot of them were month to month figuring out how they were going to keep their lights on. And I asked them, I said, listen, you spent your whole life marching, picketing, being spat upon, jailed, with signs, protesting, why only this, why only that, and why black people didn't have the right to vote, couldn't sit down at the restaurant counter and order burger and fries like everybody else. And I said, and young people today, they don't know what you invested so that today, anywhere they have the money to live, they can live, basically, because, you have to work through redlining and all of that stuff too. But right now they can go into any college and they have the money to go into. And I said, they can vote, even though, that's being challenged, but they still can legally vote everywhere in this country. I said, do you resent the fact that they don't understand, how precious what they have was because of what you gave up to get it? And almost to a personality, they would get real emotional. The little old lady would grab my arm and they say, oh no, baby, you don't understand. We were part of the greatest social revolution this country's history. We tore down the Cotton Curtain. We challenged Jim Crow. We we called on America. We pushed America to be what it said it was. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men, and it should have said and women, right, are created equal with certain inalienable rights. And so they didn't say all that, but they said that, that it was such a privilege and an honor for them to be part of this. And so most of them didn't have a high school education, or they left right after high school. Very few of them were college educated. And I said, well, wow, you know, the good Lord has blessed me with the chance to go to school where I could, wherever I had the grades to go, to travel the world and to see how fortunate and blessed we are as Americans. Because I am very patriotic today, to this day, but I believe it's like raising a kid, in my opinion. If you love your kid, you will correct them when they're wrong. You will challenge them. You will hold them accountable. And if you don't do that, I have to question how much you really love them, right? And so I feel a responsibility to do that with this country, with this leadership, with this president. And again, I've worked for 5 presidents and didn't agree with any of them on everything, right? And if you agree with everything that anybody does, I'm real scared of you. There's something wrong there.
Yeah.
But this one, this time is something. This is a whole nother animal. And so, uh, so they, I said, I started to interview these people, and that's how my first book came about. And it's called "Living in the Shadows of a Legend: Unsung Heroes and Sheroes Who Marched with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr." And so these are all people, 20 people. They're men, they're women, they're young, they're old, they're black, they're white, they're Jewish, and they're kind of from all over the country. And all of them did something different. I'll give you an example. One of them is a young Jewish guy named Willie Leventhal, who was at UCLA in 1965 when Dr. King went to all these predominantly white colleges and universities, recruiting kids to come south to do voter registration and education. This was in the summer of 65. This is before the passage of the Voting Rights Act. And so uh, the Voting Rights Act, they had thought it would be passed before because of what happened in Birmingham, then it stalled out. In Birmingham, where the fire hoses on the little children that were out of school in marching, and Kelly Ingram Park, and Bull Connor, the police chief, had the German shepherds, snapping at the kids and the people and all of that. So, but then it didn't get passed. It got bogged down. And so Willie heard Dr. King speak, and he was excited. He wanted to come help, but he was afraid. He called his dad, and Willie and I became really good friends. Okay, but he called his dad, and he told him the phone got really silent. His mom didn't want him to go. His mom was concerned, like moms are. And he told me his dad told him for the first time in his life. He told me this. His dad told him he was proud of him.
Oh,
Now, Willie got mad at me because I wanted to write that, because he said, my dad will disinherit me if you write that. So we went through a lot of things, but you talk about trauma. Willie became a really good friend of mine. But he had a lot of demons, because I think they talked about the fact that all these people, there's the people that were they hated the most in the civil rights movement, the white Southerners, the intransigents, who didn't want to see change, were the white liberals who came and sided with the black people who were part of this mission. And so they said it was every day. It was like living in a war zone. And a lot of them had post traumatic trauma from that, and then they exhibited in different ways. Sometimes alcohol, sometimes drugs, sometimes anger, sometimes sex. Whatever it was. And Willie, unfortunately, committed suicide about 7 years ago. And so, that's trauma. And Willie, and I feel, I feel some level of guilt, because Willie book was in a place, and and then he had a falling out with the bookstore people, because Willie could be bombastic, right? And my book was accepted in there, and he thought I should have my book in there because they didn't want his book in there. And then Willie stopped speaking for me for a while. So I kind of, I feel a kind of way about that, and it's bothering me. But I mean, so yeah, trauma does inform all of our lives. But so people like that I wrote about, and he really ended up writing the first report after the King Holiday bill was passed. And because Congress said that there had to be a report filed about all of the initiatives and movements and campaigns and things that happened on that first King holiday. So he's very proud of that. And so I was able to write about him. And then there's this lady named Kat Twine in St. Augustine, Florida. And she used to shuck oysters for 5 cents a barrel growing up. And she would march and protest because she had to walk several miles to the one black school in town. And the bus with the white kids would ride by her every day and they would spit on her and call her names and throw stuff out. And so she would protest because you could vote in St. Augustine, but she couldn't sit at the lunch counter and order a hamburger and fries or a milkshake like the white kids. And she couldn't go in and try on the blouse and the skirt. And so she'd protest. And you can imagine how hot it is in St. Augustine. Every day she'd get off work and she'd get a sign and she'd start walking in front of the store protesting the fact that they were being treated unequally. And so, great story. There are other stories, but they ended up when I was able to interview her, and she has a hat that's in the National African American Civil Rights Museum in D.C. that just opened, and it says freedom across it. They used to call her the Rosa Parks of Florida. So people like that, like the guy that introduced that came to DC. I'm sorry, came to Atlanta after Dr. King had graduated, and they'd had a prominent pastor at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery beforehand, and he left. They'd run him out of because he was a little too radical for them. He actually ended up being a very famous pastor by the name of Vernon Johns. But he came and knocked on Dr. King's dad's house on Auburn Avenue, and Dr. King was in the kitchen, and his dad answered the phone. I mean, answered the door, and he listened to the guy pitch his son about why he should go to Montgomery. And Dr. King says, his words, not mine, Martin, you don't want to go to that big nigga church. All they're gonna do is kick you out because they had a reputation for you know, whatever you did wasn't good enough. They called it a silk stocking church. It was like we're the black elite, and there were a few in Montgomery did go to church. But anyway, he goes to church. He takes the job. Goes guest preaching thing. He takes the job, goes down there. Of course, meets Rosa Parks, and is elected the president of Montgomery Improvement Association, and launches both of them to worldwide fame. So how would this world have been different had not Robert Nesbitt, the chairman of the pulpit committee at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, gone and recruited Dr. King to Montgomery? So, uh, and he's the first chapter in my book.
Oh,
And
wow.
so for me to be able to privilege and the honor to help people, because I don't think anybody else has written a chapter about him, to meet these people. And there's one other story out of Montgomery, but he was, when I interviewed him, he was either 94 or 95. So I have a picture of him before and a picture after. And this one other guy, I'll tell you one other story about that part. And so that when I got exposed to these people, I said, this is what I'm supposed to do with my life, with my education, with my exposure and my craft. But also in Montgomery, there's this guy who was the treasurer of the Montgomery Improvement Association, and that's the mother organization of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Um, because they had this saying in Montgomery that Black people in Montgomery couldn't come together over anything. And they were the most people in the town. They were like 75% of Montgomery was Black. But after they arrested Rosa Parks, this movement swelled up and they did come together and they hung together for 381 days until the city of Montgomery buckled and started treating them like sit wherever you want on the bus, right? Well, uh, the second guy, who's, I don't have my book in front of me, I can't remember his name right now for some strange reason. My old boss used to say he didn't have Alzheimer's. He had part-timers. Part of the time he remembered it, part of the time he didn't. But but in the morning he would drive one of his cars, these workers who weren't going to ride the bus, maybe 5, 7 miles to where they had to work, because most of them were domestics, right? Because they didn't have college degrees. They didn't. A lot of them didn't have high school degrees, but they worked for white people, and they could hear a lot of the things going on, so they could be the eyes and the ears of movement and bring things back. But then in the evening, he'd switch and drive a different car, because if you got caught transporting these people because they wouldn't ride the bus, you were in a lot of trouble. And so he was terrified, but he did it. And so anyway, and when I met him, he was also in his 90s. And so I kind of have a before picture in the front of the book and them in their heyday, and then the picture of them at the time I met them, which is, and his hands were real gnarly. And he actually met Viola Liuzzo the night that she died, which she was killed, because they were both in the caravan that took riders to Montgomery, where they were celebrating at the end of the Selma to Montgomery March. And all these the reason that movement was so successful was because young white kids, all these colleges and universities, started believing that Black equality should be, that's what this country was supposed to be. So you had Peter, Paul, and Mary, and Paul Newman, and all of these, Joan Baez, all of these people, and they were there celebrating. And then afterwards, the Klan, who had seen her working in the office down in Selma, making phone calls, making posters, working right alongside these Black activists, and they had targeted her and they followed her, and she had this young Black boy with her in the car, and they shot her dead. Her body laid on his, and they thought he was dead too. He played dead, and he got up and left town and didn't come back for years. But so he had met her that night. So anyway, after the book came out, and one of his kids, I was still at HHS, U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. I got this cryptic message. Are you Derric Gilliard, who wrote this book, Living in the Shadows of a Legend? I wrote back, yeah, I am. She said, are you the one that wrote the book that had the chapter on John Thomas? His name comes back. I said, yeah, that was me. And then she says, listen, I just wanted to tell you, on behalf of me and my 8 brothers and sisters, John Thomas was my dad, and he said he worked 70 years in the civil rights movement. They said nobody ever thanked him, nobody ever gave him an award, but because you wrote this chapter about him in this book, he will be forever known and memorialized for the role he played. And I can't tell you, Melanie, what that did. It made to me worth anything and everything, because I could see, my something I could contribute, just to these people who contributed so much to me and the country. And so when I see people not willing to vote or think it doesn't matter if they vote, or, all of that stuff, it really, it angers me and it hurts me deeply. And so I try and, when the first book came out, it was because it was kind of not looking at the people at the top, but other people that were contributors, and it really hit a chord. And I've spoken at dozens of colleges and universities about that book. And again, it was safe because these people did what they did nonviolently. Nobody was fighting back. They were turning the other cheek, and yet, in a sense, shaming America into doing what it needed to do.
Yeah.
And then to go from that to where we are today, there's that through line. These people did what they did to to gain our right that should have been there for forever, and now we see the this move, the this mission, Project 2025, to claw that back and to what it's like birthright citizenship, and women's maternal health rights and all of these kind of things. And so Yeah, it's so for me, and to me, and I'm a believer. I'm Christian, and I think a lot of what I do and stand for is informed by that. But so I believe that I was very strategically put in the places that I've been put into, not by I would have never uh, seen this, foreseen this, asked for this, or wanted it, but this is what I'm supposed to do. And then to be my oldest son started having seizures when he was 17. He was in high school, senior, and kind of out of the blue, we knew he wasn't taking drugs. This is the one, by the way, we just celebrated his 45th birthday. It's the reason I'm clogged up, this weather change. And so I had to go get quote unquote a real job because they my boss, Dr. Joseph Lowry, who was a Presidential Medal of Freedom winner. He's the one at the end of Obama's first inauguration. They
Mhm.
brought him out in a wheelchair, and he did the benediction. And I don't, you may or may not remember that. It was controversial because that's kind of who he was. But he was retiring, and I knew the organization wasn't going to be the same. So I had to start looking for a real job. And only one of two times I ever got a job through an application was this white liberal nurse who was the regional director for HHS at the time, said her office staff needed to better reflect the people who we served in the 8 southeastern states.
Mhm.
And for some of your listeners who may not know, so this is the blackest region of the country because this is where the roots of slavery and Jim Crow basically is in this part of the country. It's the most health disparities. They call it also the stroke belt, right?
Mhm.
So the most diabetes, the most heart disease, high blood pressure, the most amputees, the most, all of these things are there. You also have seven of our governors, our eight governors were Republican. They had no interest in expanding Medicaid, which is how the Affordable Care Act was designed so that every state would expand Medicaid. Now, I guarantee you, each of them have superb health insurance, right? But they don't care about, in my opinion, the working poor, people who work, and a lot of people who work they may work 70 hours a week. A lot of them may park cars and cut hair or
Mhm.
stock grocery stores or, do nails. They do things where they don't have health insurance. And so they have to make choices, okay? Uh, do I have health insurance or do I eat or do I have a place to stay and have a car to get back and forth? So, but you take them out of our society and everything grinds to a halt. Like right now, we're chasing down immigrants who are in the fields in California harvesting uh, fruits and vegetables and crops, right? And so, what's that going to do to our economy? But we don't want to give these people health insurance, and so and what I know after 25 years working and implementing policy, supporting policy, and working at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, one of the key parts of the Affordable Care Act was it focused on preventive health care. Like you get a checkup every year, and in that checkup, if there's a major red flag, they're supposed to see it, identify it, and start treating you for it because a lot of people who are uninsured. I remember one year I was uninsured and didn't go to the doctor. Didn't go to the doctor. Got really sick. I had double pneumonia and I drugged myself in. But fortunately, I wasn't. It wasn't a terrible situation. But a lot of people with chronic illnesses will wait, and then they go to the doctor, and it ends up costing them 3 to 4 times as much because chronic care is much more expensive. And a lot of times you're just keeping people alive at that point in time, and it's very intensive and expensive. And so why not? There used to be a commercial, and you wouldn't be old enough to remember this. Was Midas oil filters, and the commercial said, "Pay me now or pay me later," and
Yeah.
that's kind of the proposition. So these governors didn't want to expand Medicaid. And I'll give you an example. There's a white congressman named Joe Wilson out of South Carolina. I can't tell you which district, but I remember him saying it's the politically correct thing to be against the black man in the White House. And you may remember Senator Mitch McConnell, who was the majority whip, and he said his number one goal was to make Obama a one-term president. So there was this thing. And so, when Obama was elected. So for me, it was because when I first was hired, one of the key things one of my responsibilities was to all the people we spent money with, we provided grants for, we worked with in partnership, was to make sure that they had some equity in terms of who the decision makers were, who was at the table,
Yeah.
who was so make sure that there was some of these resources were being spread out. And
Yeah.
so for me, it was a continuation of the justice work I had done at HHS. Like one of the things we did I'm sorry, at the SCLC, one of the things we did at the SCLC, and I forgive me for kind of doubling back because it kind of connects though. We signed economic pacts with companies like Publix, uh, Shoney's, well, Denny's actually, and one other company. And what these were worth hundreds of millions of dollars. And what these said was, if your company comes into a community, you have to hire a certain percentage of black managers. You have to have a certain percentage of black, and money goes to black suppliers and vendors. And you have to have some kind of track so where black people can also climb the ladder and advance. And, so those are the kind of things that we did. And we put pressure on companies like Coca-Cola and Georgia Power to do the same thing. And you can see some of the vestiges of that right now, because one of the people we partnered with was a guy named Jamal Bryant, and he's at a very prominent church here in Atlanta. And he's the one that instituted this boycott against Target. I don't know if you're familiar with the Target boycott, which has made a real impression. And now they're kind of going after Dollar General. And these are all companies that were strong supporters of DEI. But then when the president comes and says, hey, all this woke stuff needs to go. So for me, that work and this work, there's this real through line and there's this continuity. And so yeah, so that's part of the kind of things I did, and then to implement the Affordable Care Act. So we got to the point where we had the historic all-time low for Black and Brown uninsurance rates in this country because a lot of people didn't like it, but part of the ACA said that people who could afford it helped supplement the cost of insurance for the people who couldn't afford it. But again, I think it ends up saving communities money because, and you look at all there's this huge rural hospitals are closing all over the country because you take away their Medicaid dollars, they're not going to be able to survive. So we're going to be in a world of trouble. And of course, you know what's happening at the CDC and the NIH. So all of our research is going away, all of our progress we've been making on all these various forms of cancer is going to be set back maybe decades. And people of the sharpest, brightest minds who wanted to come to this country and do research aren't going to come anymore. They can't get in, or they're afraid if they come, will they be able to stay? So
Yeah.
all of these kind of things. So for me to be able to work in that space, and at the end of the day, our 8 states, by the time President Obama left office, our 8 states was responsible for just under 24% of the people who had enrolled in Obamacare, the ACA, in the entire country in one 8 state, so whatever that is, one fifth of not even one fifth of the country. So we were really proud, in particular being this all black staff who was working because, there were two kind of, if you expanded Medicaid, we work hand in hand with the state. But these other states who said, well, listen, if you want to expand Medicaid, you got to come in here and do it yourself. We're not going to help you. You got to come build the coalitions. You got to establish the relationships. You have to come in here and do everything because we don't want any parts of it. And sometimes not only did they wouldn't help us, they fought us. So for us to have that kind of an impact, and the reason being is so many people in this region of the country had never had health insurance. And the black and brown people in many instances didn't feel comfortable going into the federally qualified health centers which provide 40, a lot of people don't know this, roughly 40% of all of the primary care health care in this country is provided by the FQHCs. But if I don't feel like you're going to treat me as a human being, or you really don't want me there, I'm not going to go there because I don't feel welcome. And so there were, I won't name the states, but there were certain places where we ran into this all the time.
Yeah.
And so we ran into it as a federal government, that as a funding arm. You can imagine what it's like